Good morning. And last week we kicked off this series on heroes, and we said that the most ordinary people make the most extraordinary heroes. People like you and like me, we don't have to have superhuman strength. We don't have to be able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. We don't have to have spidey senses like my wife, but instead there is one thing that we need, and we need God's presence in our lives. It's not that we need God to be with us, it's that we need to be with God. Because you see, those are two profoundly different perspectives on spiritual life. If we want for God to be with us, it means that we want to do what we want to do. We want to make decisions that we want to make. We want to live our lives the way we want to live them. And then we just want to invite God in and say, would you just bless everything that I want to do? That's profoundly different than this, than saying that I want to align my life with His. And I want to learn from Jesus. I want to follow Jesus. I want to live like Jesus, and I want to give my life to Him. And see, that's profoundly different than the first perspective. And the second, that's the kind of life that God chooses to honor and to bless. He wants to use our ordinary life to do something extraordinary. But here's the thing, is that even though He wants to do that, we have to allow Him to do that in our lives and through our lives. He doesn't force Himself upon us and make us do things. We have to allow God into our lives and to work through our lives. But unfortunately, there's something that holds us back. There's something that holds us back. But here's what we do. We have the best of intentions. We like to make all kinds of promises. We like to make deals that if God would just show up, if He would but heal us, if He would but do this work in our lives, if He would do something incredible, well, if He would do all those things, then we'd be all in. That we'd change and that we would live our lives for Him. But unfortunately, there's something that gets in the way. We say to ourselves, this is it. I'm drawing a line in the sand and I'm done. I'm never going back. That things are going to change and that I'm ready to leave the past behind me and I'm ready to take those next steps into God's best for my life. But there's this powerful force that shows up, and unfortunately, far too often, it holds us back. We tell ourselves that we've had enough. We've been here time and time before, and we're not going to do it again, and we're ready to make some hard decisions. I know I've been there. And then we tell ourselves, well, we'll just stop hanging around with some of the people that we hang around with. And we'll stop doing some of the things that we've been doing. We tell ourselves that this change of scenery will help us change and to make better decisions. And we convince ourselves on Sunday that we're going to make it happen on Monday. But there's just something that holds us back. And that something is fear. Because fear paralyzes us. Fear stifles productive thoughts and actions. It's a roadblock in our lives. Fear leads to destructive habits. It steals our peace and contentment. Fear creates uncertainty and doubt. And in fact, fear is the opposite of faith. Last week, I confessed and I told you that I'm afraid of flying. and you didn't like vote me off the island. So this week I'm going to confess again and tell you that I'm afraid of roller coasters. Some of you are nodding your head, and maybe some of you are as well. I don't like heights. I get motion sick very easily. And so, I mean, at a young age, I remember my grandpa forcing me to get on a roller coaster at Indiana Beach, right? It was probably like the smallest thing out there. But he forced me to get on this thing, and I was scared to death. And I was reminded of that 2 weeks ago when we took some students to Kings Island. My wife and I, we had a small group of them. We split up into groups, and the first one, I think it was called Vertigo or something like that. Like right when you walk in, I'm looking at it thinking, man, that doesn't look that bad. It doesn't look that tall. It doesn't look that fast until you get closer to it. And you hear the people screaming as they're doing a loop-de-loop. And I'm like, yeah, I don't need to get on. So I didn't get on that one. But after walking around the park a little bit with some students, riding like one of those small log rides that I could handle, we get on this one ride, and literally it's probably the slowest, smallest. It's the ride for wimps like me. And we get on that thing, and it wasn't all that bad. But man, when I got off of it, I just felt like, because you're still you're going a little fast and you're going around curves. So then the next one we come to is this roller coaster. I think it's called Racer or Racers. There's these two that go side by side. And I watched as these small students and my wife go to get in line, and I stand there and I'm like, no, I'm not getting on it. I can't get on it. I can't do it. I can't do it. And I'm like, come on, man. Where's your courage? I'm like, all right. So I follow them in, and I get up to where they start getting in the seats, and I'm like, I don't think so. And even right before, I'm like, I don't want to do this. But I step into the thing and I sit down and I get locked in, and I just know it's a mistake. And we take off, and and you start, and it's that click, 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 click. And I'm like, this is not going to end well. And we go down that first hill, and your stomach is gone, and you're like, I can't take this. And that wasn't as bad as when we came up the hill and got ready to go over the next hill, and you felt like the whole coaster was going to come up off the tracks. And I look to my left, and it's a wooden coaster. And I look over to my left, and I swear that wood looks like it's been there for like 100 years. And I begin to think, man, if there's just one thing that could go wrong, it's going to happen when I'm on it. And so, I got my head forward, and Jill's right next to me. She goes, no, lean your head back. It's better. So I lean my head back, and then your head starts pounding against that mat in the back. I'm like, no, not a good plan. And I don't know how many hills, but I forget who it was. I started screaming the kid's name in front of me. I'm like, that helps. And I got off, and I'm like, I remember why I don't ride roller coasters. That fear and that thing in my stomach, I'm like, I'm done. I don't get on another one. That's terrible. You guys who like roller coasters, you're weird. But that fear, it's the fear that all of us face at times. And we talked last week about this guy Moses, who I think he succumbed to fear, and he had all these doubts. And we talked last week about how he continued to push back at God. He continued to protest when God called him to go to deliver the people of Israel. He continued to push back, and he protested. And I think it was out of a place of fear that he did that. And so we're going to fast forward about 40 years from where God showed up in that burning bush to call Moses. And if you want to grab a Bible in the seat back in front of you, if you want to use an electronic device, if you've got a tablet or an iPhone or something like that, and you want to pull up the Bible on that's great. We're going to look at Numbers chapter 13 and 14. That's where we're going to be. But just to kind of catch up a little bit, I can't fill in all the spaces, but so that from the time that God called Moses to go, to be his voice, to deliver his people from the Egyptians, God shows up and he does just what he says he would do. He shows up in an incredible, mighty way, and he sends these plagues, right, on Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And after these plagues happen, Pharaoh finally says, all right, I will let your people go. And so he releases the Israelite people, and as they're leaving, they're marching out of there. And as a little bit of time goes by, Pharaoh decides, no, I don't think so. And he begins to pursue the Israelites. And so the Israelites find themselves in this position where they've got the Red Sea on one side, and behind them is the oncoming army of Egypt. And God shows up in an incredible way, this pillar of fire of protection behind them. And as if that wasn't enough, God shows up in another way, and he parts the Red Sea for them so that they can cross on dry land. And so they move through, and as they get to the other side, God's protection of this cloud by fire goes away, and the Egyptian army begins to pursue them. And as they get in the middle of the Red Sea, God then brings those walls of water back together and just devastates the Egyptian army. And so if that wasn't enough for the people just to believe and to know that God is such an incredible God and that he is going to be with them and he will continue to be with them, they find themselves on the edge of this promised land. This land that God was going to give them. They'd been wandering and they'd been in slavery. And it was this land described as flowing with milk and honey. And they find themselves on the edge of this land. We pick it up in Numbers chapter 13. The Lord now said to Moses, "Send out men to explore the land of Canaan, the land I am giving to the Israelites." We've got to stop right there. And if you can, flip forward a few pages to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 20 through 23. Because if we read that passage right there, we would think that it was God who sent those 12 scouts to scout out the land before the nation of Israel occupied it. But that's not what Deuteronomy tells us. We find in verse 20, Moses says, "I said to you, you have now reached the hill country of the Amorites that the Lord our God is giving us. Look, he has placed the land in front of you. Go and occupy it as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged." Then there's that word, but, verse 22, "But you all came to me and said, 'First, let us send out scouts to explore the land for us. They will advise us on the best possible routes, which towns we should enter.'" Now, what part of that sounds like faith to you? If I remember right, God had promised to give them that land, but yet the people decided to take it upon themselves that they knew better than God. And you know what? We better just check it out first. We better dip our toe in the water a little bit before we go all in. And we better send some scouts ahead to make sure it's okay that we go. Chapter 13 of the book of Numbers. "So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He sent out 12 men, all tribal leaders of Israel, from their camp in the wilderness of Paran. These were the tribes and the names of their leaders," and that will be reading pleasure for you later. "These are the names of the men Moses sent out to explore the land. Moses gave the men these instructions as he sent them out to explore the land. Go north through the Negev into the hill country, see what the land is like, and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak, few or many. See what kind of land they live in. Is it good? Is it bad? Do their towns have walls, or Are they unprotected like open camps? Is the soil fertile or poor? Are there many trees? Do your best to bring back samples from the crops that you see. Again, does this little paragraph, does it sound like they're stepping out in faith? Does it sound like they've trusted God with everything? And that God said right here at the beginning of this, send out the men to explore the land of Canaan, the land I am giving, right? So they knew that God was giving them the land, but instead they choose to act out amongst themselves and to send these scouts to see if it's okay for them to go into this land. It doesn't sound like faith. It sounds like, well, we're going to go take a peek. And if it doesn't look like we think, then we just may take a different route. If these cities, if they're fortified and they're not like open camps and tents, and I don't know if we can overcome fortified cities. But what if the land isn't fertile? What if it's just poor, rocky soil? Why would we go into this land? I mean, everything about this questions God and questions the decisions that he made for them. So verse 21, so they went up and explored the land, from the wilderness of Zin as far as near Yep. Going north, they passed through the Negev and arrived at Hebron, where these people lived. When they came to the valley of Eshcol, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes so large. Anybody got fruit like this? Got some folks that live down the road from me that got a pretty good garden, but I don't know that they have grapes like this. A cluster of grapes so large that it took two of them to carry it on a pole between them. They also brought back samples of pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol. After exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned. They returned to Moses, to Aaron, and the whole community of Israel. They reported to the whole community what they had seen and showed them the fruit they had taken from the land. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it indeed is bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is the kind of fruit it produces, right? So they bring back this huge grapevine, right, that's on this pole that two of these men have to carry. And they bring back these pomegranates and figs. And I can imagine, man, these guys have been eating manna and quail, right? And they're like, oh, this stuff is amazing. They're popping grapes and they say this is a bountiful land. It's bountiful country. It is a land flowing with milk and honey, just as though God had said. And what's the next word? But, right? So they begin with this good report of how good the land was. And we get to verse 28 and they say, but there's this catch. The people living there, they're powerful and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, they live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. So they throw in this but. Yeah, it's a bountiful country. Yeah, the food is great. Yeah, the produce is amazing. The soil is fertile. But, man, there's these people, and they're huge. I mean, they're warriors, and there is no way that we could overtake them. There's no way that we could win a battle against them. Their cities, they're fortified. They're not just open tents, that we can come in and ransack. No, they've got walls around their cities. And in essence, I mean, they're saying, I don't think we can do this. I don't know if this is possible. And so can you imagine, can you hear the whole assembly of Israel as they begin to grumble, they begin to complain, they begin to whine, they begin to act out like, wait a minute, this is where we're supposed to be going, and this land isn't the land that we had hoped and expected that it would be. But Caleb Caleb speaks up. Verse 30, Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. I can imagine the enthusiasm. I can imagine the excitement, because he's probably, as he's sitting there listening to these 10 scouts and their report, he's probably sitting there shaking his head, scratching his head, saying, I don't know what they're saying, but he's waiting. He's giving them their time. And so Caleb speaks up, and in a loud voice, I can imagine him saying, let's go at once to take the land. We certainly can conquer it. Do you see fear in this? Do you see fear at all in Caleb? Man, Caleb didn't see these giants. He wasn't overwhelmed by their size. He wasn't overwhelmed by the fortified cities. No, he sees something different. He says, let's go at once, man. Let's not hesitate, but let's take this land. It is ours to conquer. Caleb had a different perspective. He saw things in a different light. Verse 31, but the 10 scouts, they begin to raise their voices again. But the other men who had explored the land with him, they disagreed. And there's this argument going on and back and forth. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored, it will devour anyone who goes to live there. Now, my guess is they probably didn't mean literally, but I'm taking it literally. Like they're saying, man, there are just these big holes in the land and people were just falling in it and it's just eating them up. They've just got this incredibly humanistic view of the land in which they scouted out. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants. We saw these huge dudes, man, and they were powerful, and they were big, and they were scary, and their breath stunk. We even saw these giants. They were the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And you know what? You know what? We called a bunch of these guys in, and we had this focus group meeting. We asked them a bunch of questions. We gave them a survey, and we said, hey, what do you think of us? And guess what they think? They thought of us that we looked like grasshoppers too. You think that's what they did? I mean, that's what they said. They said that's what they thought too. How is it that these 10 scouts knew what these people that occupied the land, how'd they know what they were thinking? I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy the conclusions that we will draw when we draw them out of a state of fear. Chapter 14. Then the whole community, they began to weep out loud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. Listen to this. If only we had died in Egypt. Man, why didn't we just die in Egypt? Why didn't we just stay there? Man, it was so much better in Egypt as we were having to make bricks and find our own straw, and we were getting beaten by these Egyptians. It was so much greater there, right? Their voices rose in a great chorus in protest. If we had only died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? And then next, they play the family card. They play the wife card, the kid card. They say our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Have you ever been there? Have you ever said to yourself, I can't do that? And you've used your loved ones as an excuse. I can't go do that because I've got to provide for my family. I've got to protect my wife. What if I do make this decision and I go here and I say this and I approach these people? What might happen to my family? What might people say about my wife and my kids? And man, it is a great way to hide and not do what God wants you to do. We play the family card. It's not about me and my fear. Oh, I'm taking care of my family, right? I've got their best interest at heart while I don't obey what God wants me to do. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? They plotted amongst themselves, let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. I mean, man, you can read this and you can say to yourself, man, how in the world are they here? How in the world are they thinking these things? Why are they saying these things? Why are they making these decisions? Why are they disobeying? And then it's about that quick that we realize that as we read the story, we realize how we connect with the story. And we realize it's not just a story about the nation of Israel and how they rebelled and how they disobeyed and how they chose not to follow God when God called them. But we realize, man, this is a story of us. This is a story of my life and a story of how I act at times and how I rebel and how I don't give God my best and how I don't follow him when I should. But you know what? God's faithful. He's ready to forgive. He's ready to grant mercy and extend grace. And that's what he did for the nation of Israel. Time and time again, they rebelled. He forgave. They rebelled. And we see ourselves in the story. And so as much as we just want to pile on here and say, man, they didn't get it. They didn't understand. They're crazy. We've got to take caution. And we've got to see ourselves in the story. Then Moses and Aaron, they did what they knew to do. They fell face down on the ground before the whole community of Israel. Two of the men who had explored out the land, Joshua and Caleb, they tore their clothes. They said to all the people of Israel, the land we traveled through and explored, it is a wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It is a rich land flowing with milk and honey. And so you ask yourself, how do we know if God is pleased with us? How do we know if we're on the right track? How do we know if what we're doing, if we're following him, if it's the right thing, and if God truly is pleased with our actions and our attitudes and our worship? How do we know if God's pleased with that? Verse 9 says, do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. This is an incredible perspective from them. They are only helpless prey to us. Remember the 10 scouts? They saw these giants. They saw these incredible warriors. They saw these fortified cities. But Caleb and Joshua, they saw something different. They didn't see that from a human perspective. They say they're only helpless prey to us. They have no protection. Wait a minute, that doesn't sound like what we heard, right? The cities, they're fortified. These guys are huge. My guess is they probably had armor. They probably had stuff to protect them in battle. But the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. So how do we know if God's pleased with us? I think there's these three things right here in this verse. Don't rebel against God. Obey him. Don't be afraid. Stand up in faith. And the last one, just know that God's with us. Know that he's with us as he was with them. Verse 10 begins with what word? But. It's like this pendulum just continues to swing back and forth. But the whole community began to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. And it was about that point that God had had enough. And so God shows up. And as it says, the glorious presence of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tabernacle. And the Lord said to Moses, how long? I hope we never get here. But the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? Will they never believe me even after all the miraculous signs I've done among them? I will disown them and destroy them with a plague. I mean, remember what they'd been through? Remember what they'd seen? Whether it was the plagues, whether it was the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, the protection at the Red Sea, parting of the Red Sea. I mean, they saw so much from God and how he was with them and how he protected them, how he delivered them. Man, and God saying, how long? I will disown them and destroy them with a plague. Then I will make you into a nation greater and mightier than they. But Moses objected. Man, Moses is pretty good at objecting to God, isn't he? Moses objected. What will the Egyptians think when they hear about it? He asked the Lord, they know full well the power you displayed in rescuing your people from Egypt. Now, if you destroy them, the Egyptians will send a report to the inhabitants of this land, who have already heard that you live among your people. They know, Lord, that you have appeared to your people face to face, and that your pillar of cloud hovers over them. They know that you go before them in the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. Now, if you slaughter all these people, the nations that have heard of your fame will say, the Lord was not able to bring them into the land he swore to give them. So he killed them in the wilderness. Please, Lord, prove that your power is as great as you have claimed. For you said the Lord is slow to anger and filled with unfailing love, forgiving every kind of sin and rebellion. But he does not excuse the guilty. He lays the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations. In keeping with your magnificent, unfailing love, please pardon the sins of this people, just as you have forgiven them ever since they left Egypt. And the Lord said, I will pardon them as you have requested. But, God has a but here. But as surely as I live and as surely as the earth is filled with the Lord's glory, not one of these people will ever enter the land. They have all seen my glorious presence and the miraculous signs I performed both in Egypt and in the wilderness. But again and again they have tested me by refusing to listen to my voice. They will never even see the land I swore to give their ancestors. None of those who have treated me with contempt will ever see it. But my servant Caleb, he has a different attitude than the others. He has remained loyal to me, so I will bring him into the land he explored. So he ends up sending the nation of Israel out to wander. And they end up dying out there because of their disobedience. But Caleb and Joshua, they had a different perspective. They didn't live out of fear, but yet they chose to live out of faith. And so there's four things as I read through this story, just four things that I think we can learn all from this. And the first one is this, is that fear not only holds us back, but fear blinds us from the truth. Fear blinds us from the truth, but faith sees beyond what we see. We can see in the report from these 10 scouts that they saw with their own eyes. They saw these huge individuals, these giants. They saw these fortified cities, and they thought to themselves, from seeing with their own eyes, we can't do this. This isn't something that we can accomplish. We're not strong enough. We're not powerful enough. And they were very focused on themselves and their abilities and their strengths and what they could do because they saw things with their own eyes. But Caleb and Joshua, they had a different perspective. They saw something different. They saw beyond the giants. They saw beyond the fortified walls. And they saw from an attitude of faith because they knew that God had given them the land. They knew that God would be with them and that God would protect them and deliver them. The second thing is this, is that fear not only holds us back, but fear gives in to the majority. Fear gives in to the majority, but faith stands firm against the crowd. I can imagine that these 10, as they were giving their report, as word began to spread in the whole nation, and they began to get upset, and they began to cry and moan and be like, well, why don't we just go back to Egypt? Why are we here? Why has God brought us here just so we could die here? That as their voices got louder, the 10 I'm guessing that they probably had more boldness and more confidence, because if they're with us, then we've got the majority. It's so easy to get swept up and swept in by the majority, that current. There are so many around us that they can have loud voices, big voices, convincing voices, and they can lead us down a path other than the one that God has called us to. And it's hard to have faith enough to be able to stand firm against the crowd, because, man, the crowd can get loud and the crowd can have an incredible force against us, but it is not greater than God's force. And so faith can help us stand firm against the crowd. Number 3 is this: fear not only holds us back, but fear holds back others around you. Fear holds back others around you. But faith brings out the best in others. I don't know that I'm ready to lay blame on the 10, because I believe that the Israelites, that this is where they were. But can you just imagine the influence that those 10 had on the thousands and hundreds of thousands of people in the nation of Israel? And how, because they chose to listen to the bad report of the 10, that they ended up wandering in the desert many more years and ended up dying in the desert and never made it to the promised land, because of the report of those 10. I mean, the influence that you have is incredible. And I think that my guess is that many of us don't truly understand the influence that we do have, and the impact that our decisions have on those around us, that they have on your family, that they have in your community, that they have in your group of friends. The decisions that you make have an incredible impact, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, on those around you. But faith brings out the best in others. Man, if you can be that voice of faith, if you can be that voice of truth, if you can be that one that continues to draw people back in to following that narrow path that God has for us, man, you can be an incredible influence on the lives of others. Lastly, fear not only holds us back, but fear limits what God will do through you. Fear limits what God will do through you, but faith will take you to the promised land. God only goes so far. I believe we saw it last week with Moses, that God revealed himself in the burning bush. He reveals himself to us. But then God's next step of calling Moses wasn't until Moses took a step towards the bush. So I believe that God reveals himself to us, to you. He reveals himself, and then we respond. We respond, God reveals himself. We respond again, God reveals himself. And I believe it's this back and forth, this give and take. God's not going to force you. He's not going to make you. He's not going to just show up and this is it. He's going to give us an opportunity to respond. And he's going to allow us the opportunity to respond in faith or in fear. And we have the choice. Are we going to respond from a state of fear, not trusting, not believing, not knowing that God will be with us? Or are we going to respond from a position of faith and say, yes, I know that God is with us. I know that he goes before us. He has prepared all of this for me, and I'm going to be obedient, and I'm going to do what God asks me to do. See, because fear sees obstacles, but faith sees opportunities. So let me ask, if you had to answer a question for yourself, would you say you live more out of a position of fear or out of a position of faith? Are you ready? Are you ready to take whatever that next step is that God has for you? Is there something in your life? Are there these giants in your life that have been overwhelming you, that continue to put fear in you? Or maybe you've been making decisions because, I don't know, I got my family, got to provide for my children, what might happen to them. That's all out of fear. Or are we responding out of faith? Do we know and do we believe that he is with us and that he's gone before us and that he has this promised land in store for us? Can I encourage you to step out in faith today, and whatever that is, wherever God's calling you? Let's pray. God, I am not naive to forget. I remember when I lived more out of fear than out of faith. I remember that I found all kinds of excuses, all kinds of reasons. They were good reasons in my mind of why I chose to live in fear instead of faith. So I know it's not easy. I know that it's something we can talk about, and I hope we're encouraged this morning by it. But God, help us to take that next step towards you, because I do believe and I know that you reveal yourself to us in incredible ways. And as you do, help us to respond in faith, not out of fear. Help us to respond with this resounding yes and not with questions and doubts and worry. Because just as you were powerful enough, you were strong enough, you were mighty enough, you were good enough to be there for the nation of Israel through it all, you'll be there for us too. Help us to see beyond the obstacles and to see with eyes of faith. In Jesus' name.